My name is Michael Alexander. I am the Maimonides Chair in Jewish Studies at the University of California, Riverside. Some of you know me. I hope that there are some new folks who may not, who have really stumbled upon us here. Something that we do at UCR is before public events, we have a UCR land acknowledgement, which I would like to read to you right now. We at UCR would like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, the Tongva, the Luiseño, and Serrano peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to live and to work on these homelands. So that is our introduction. Let me start by thanking our partners in this Jewish Studies series that we do every year with 3 or 4 talks. The first partner, of course, is UCR Palm Desert and the team at UCR Palm Desert that so effectively hosts these events, moves very swiftly from live events to Zoom. And to my mind, these Zoom events have been enormously successful. I also want to thank our partners at UC Riverside's CHAS, the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences, and our dean there, Dean McMullen, and our third partner, Temple Isaiah, who has been a partner and a friend of Jewish Studies for as long as I've been in the position and for as long as I've been at Riverside. So thanks to Executive Director Doug Morton and Rabbi Stephen Rosenberg for always bringing folks together. When we go live, we will certainly have events over at Temple Isaiah and the Jewish Community Center that they're building there. I do have some sad announcements to make. One of the donors to the Maimonides Chair in Jewish Studies, which is the chair that I hold, Mark Rubin of Mark and Pam Rubin. Mark passed away on Saturday, and I do want to say a word or two about Mark and his life. Mark Rubin was a Jewish person and who I believe celebrated, or if you can say celebrated, his bar mitzvah in the Theresienstadt concentration camp in Europe during the Nazi period. And I was able to interview him several times regarding his experiences then. And by a kind of miracle or luck, if you can call it luck, the Theresienstadt concentration camp was the ideal camp that the Nazis used to show to the Red Cross. And for that reason, Mark was able to stay with his family when he was incarcerated at Theresienstadt. He and most of his family, immediate family, did survive. Mark ended up in California and married Pam Rubin and ended up being a developer and really helping the Inland Empire and specifically the city of Riverside sort of get on its feet and move forward. And he and Pam were among the families that donated to the Maimonides Chair and felt it was important to have in perpetuity somebody like me on campus hosting these kinds of events and moving forward. So for that movement or that lifetime arc from behind the gates of Theresienstadt to being a person who gave so much to his community and paid so many things forward, I think is exactly what our sages meant when they spoke of righteousness. So I just want to acknowledge the family in our sorrow and grief for them, and to thank them for having a life of paying it forward. We will be creating in Mark Rubin's name a talk on the yearly talk on the theme of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and intolerance. And so that will be coming. That we were actually in the process of making it in his honor, and he has now passed away, so it will be in memorial. I want to now turn to the talk today, which in fact is sponsored by another great family that has been a supporter of the chair and a supporter of Jewish studies for many years, Bob and Cheryl Fay. This talk that we're about to give today is part of our Jewry and Innovation series, which is about Jews around the world, in Israel, not in Israel, in the United States, and apparently in Madagascar, doing new and innovative things and really changing the world. And that's the rubric under which we're introducing today our speaker, Nathan Devir, professor of religious studies at the University of Utah, where he's also served as the director of the Middle East Center and the Religious Studies Department and program. He is a great scholar of Jewish studies. I would run through all the journals in which I'll run through a couple of the journals in which he's published, just to sort of impress you here. Biblical Reception, Jewish Culture and History, the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion, the Journal of Modern Jewish Studies, Nashim, which is the Journal of Women's Studies, Religion and the Arts, Studies in American Jewish Literature. I'm not going to go on, there's just too many. But what I really want to talk to you about, and what Kelly will put in the chat for us, is the name of his monograph. He's coming out with a new book soon, and that's what we'll have him talk about. But this is a monograph that came out in 2017. It's called The New Children of Israel, Emerging Jewish Communities in the Era of Globalization. It was published by University of Utah Press a couple of years ago. To my mind, it is, if you're going to read one book of Jewish studies from the 20th century, this is the book to read. It is a fascinating study of different different groups in Africa and in India who have either discovered or rediscovered their Judaism in the 20th and the 21st centuries, and have taken it the next step to really start building for themselves fully Jewish lives. Nathan is among the few scholars that know anything about it, and his particular touch and way with describing these scenes is extremely readable. It's a wonderful, wonderful book, The New Children of Israel. And the thing that he's going to be talking to us about today is only mentioned tangentially in the book, The Jews of Madagascar, but it's a part of a project moving forward. So I very much am going to stop speaking and introduce our speaker. I'm so excited to have you here, Dr. Devir, speaking about the Jews of Madagascar.
Thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate that very generous introduction. I want to take a moment to thank Kelly, Agam, Maggie for their help in setting this lecture up. And I'm just really delighted to be with you virtually, and I will be even more delighted to take Michael up on his kind offer to do part 2 of this exchange in person once we're all able to gather together in a more face-to-face way. I'm going to share my screen here, make sure you can all follow my PowerPoint. Michael or Kelly, would you please give me a thumbs up if you can see these slides and I'm scrolling okay?
Looking good.
Great, okay. So again, thank you very much to everybody for coming, and again to Michael for the very kind words and this invitation to talk about a subject that's fascinated me for decades, and which I'll be happy to discuss with any of you individually post lecture. If you'd like to reach out, please feel free to email me at my university address, and I could talk your ear off about this for hours, but today I'll limit myself to about 40 minutes, I guess. So as Michael mentioned, the kind of larger subject here about emerging Jewish communities is what I did in this 2017 book. And that'll be the first part of this lecture, about 20 minutes, just talking about the general phenomenon. The group in Madagascar, or groups in Madagascar, I should say, that I encountered in 2013 and later, I didn't feel I could really put in this book, as this book was dedicated to discussing normative Jewish communities, these either converts or reverts, if you like, to Judaism that wish to follow rabbinic Judaism in a normative fashion. The Madagascar group, as you'll see, is a little bit different, and so I saved them for this next book, and I sent to Maggie a few links of book chapters in which I've discussed their genesis and their motivations, and I think she's going to send those to you. One of them is a book published 2 years ago called Africana Jewish Journeys that has an essay in it from me about the Madagascar groups. One of them is a book edited by Simon Bronner called Connected Jews, put out by the Littman Library of Jewish Civilization 2 years ago. And then the first time I wrote about this community was in 2015, an essay in a book called Becoming Jewish that Tudor Parfit and Nathaniel Fisher edited together. So this is all to say that some of what I'm going to talk about in Madagascar is part of this upcoming work to be published. Part of it has already seen the light of day. Just a few remarks here, a few caveats, if you like, about the groups that I'll be discussing. You know, when we talk about these far-flung or exotic or sometimes little-known groups, we often use words like neo-Jewish or Judaizing or emerging. And I just want to take a moment to highlight that I don't use these terms in any kind of pejorative sense, and I don't wish to denigrate anybody who feels as though their Jewishness is being put into question by these kind of terms. I just think it's important to delineate that a lot of these groups don't have any kind of universally accepted discursive or historical connection with Jewish groups in other locales, and therefore are seen as being a bit out of the box, right? I mean, we know there are historical examples of responsa and discursive connections between Jewish communities in Europe and places as far-flung as China and India, Yemen. But the groups that I work on mainly don't have any kind of conventionally accepted discursive or historical connection to major Jewish groups elsewhere. So that's just a caveat that these terms to mark them as being other are not any kind of a judgment call on their sense of identity, but just a way to clarify terminology. So I'll just go through a few examples here I'm sure that all of you know about. I mean, obviously the most well-known example of a marginal Jewish group is that of the so-called Falashas, which just means landless or foreign in Amharic, otherwise known as the Beta Israel, the House of Israel, the celebrated group in Ethiopia that the French ethnographer Jacques Fatlovich tried to bring to the attention of the world in the early 20th century, but which was not really well known until the famous airlifts by Israel via the Sudan of several thousands of these Ethiopian Jews in 84 and 85, and again in 1991. When Fatlovich found this group, they were practicing customs that seemed to him to indicate a legitimate kind of Israelite or Hebraic descent. And the chief rabbis of Israel actually disagreed for a number of years on whether or not this group could indeed be called the seed of Israel. There was finally an agreement made, and this celebrated airlift, the picture you have here in 84 and 85, came to be. And this is a very symbolic Exodus motif, right? William Safire in the New York Times called the airlift of the Ethiopian Jews the only time that Black Africans have been taken out of Africa, not into slavery, but into freedom, right? And so this is a very well-known example of not just a kind of marginal Jewish group, but also the only group to date that the state of Israel has recognized as being one of the lost tribes, in this case, the lost tribes of Dan. Another well-known far-flung Jewish group you likely will have heard of are the Lemba. The Lemba are a Shona-speaking Bantu people found in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Mozambique, made famous in the 1990s due to several different discoveries made by Tudor Parfit. And I would just take a moment here to highlight the contribution of Professor Tudor Parfit, whom Michael and I share as a senior colleague. Tudor Parfit is really the founding father of any kind of discipline connected to marginal Jewish communities. And I strongly encourage you to read his books. He also was the first person to write an expose of the airlift of the Ethiopian Jews, Operation Moses. And in the 1990s, he was the first person to really take seriously the oral traditions of the Lemba, who claimed to not be descended from a lost tribe, but to have a connection to the Jewish Kohanim, the priestly class. They also have a patrilineal priestly class they call the Buba, and they trace their lineage to the land of Israel via the Arabian Peninsula. So Professor Parfit worked on several books connected to the Lemba. One book was on their claim to have taken with them from Israel a replica of the Ark of the Covenant, which they called the Ngoma Lungundu, the drum that thunders. And the more famous episode, which I'm sure you have read about, is about the genetic testing done to corroborate their claim of being connected to the Kohanim. So the genetic test that Parfit carried out did indeed corroborate that the Lemba, at least in the priestly class, do have a genetic connection to Kohanim around the world through what's called the Kohan model haplotype gene. It doesn't mean they're Jewish, but it means they have a common progenitor with the Kohanim in the ancient Near East around 1000 BCE. Unlike the Ethiopians, the Lemba have not asked Israel for recognition, and Israel has not granted it. But this is just another example I'm sure you have heard about of a kind of far-flung Jewish community coming to light in the 20th century. So in the example of the Ethiopians who claim to be descended from the lost tribe of Dan, we see there's a very, very common thread with other such groups in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere trying to reestablish a connection to some kind of Hebraic or Israelite or Jewish identity. So most of the communities that I work with claim some kind of descent from the 10 lost tribes of Israel, which according to the story, as you likely know, were scattered from the land of Israel in 722 BCE into Assyria because of Israel's iniquities. And all we know about their eventual place to which they were gathered is that they went into Assyria, Ashura, Ad Hayom Hazeh, until this very day. And so the Jewish sources on the eventual presence of the lost tribes are a bit vague. And this happens in 722 BCE. It's not until a much later time that we hear a mention of them again in the Jewish sources. So kind of, aside from the great mystery of the eventual resting place of the lost Ark of the Covenant, the eventual area to which lost tribes were exiled is another one of the great mysteries. So we have, in some writings by the great historian Josephus, the author of the Jewish Wars, mention of the lost tribe living, what he says, beyond the river, likely the Euphrates, so probably somewhere in Iraq, and not again in any kind of Jewish sources until the 9th century, in which the lost tribes appear in these kind of fanciful tales told by someone calling himself Eldad the Danite from the lost tribe of Dan. Eldad was probably not an Ethiopian, although they claimed he was. Probably he was from Yemen. He spoke a strange kind of Hebrew and went swashbuckling his way around the Mediterranean era, telling tall tales of Jews who dwelt beyond the Sabbath river, the Sambation, which stopped flowing on the Sabbath and which shot out things like lightning and fire. This legend of the lost tribes existing in Ethiopia was picked up in the Christian mindset very, very strongly. And so you have the same kind of stories that appear in legends attributed to the Nestorian king Prester John, who probably was some kind of compilation of different historical personalities and who existed either in India or Ethiopia, depending on the source. Prester John also talked about the lost tribes existing beyond this Sabbath river, but he also talked about things like unicorns and dragons, so we can't really attribute too much historical veracity to the legends of Prester John. But I think it's important to point out that in the not just Jewish but Christian imagination, this idea of the lost tribes was very, very strong as a kind of mythic element. I mean, so much so that when Christopher Columbus set off for the New World, he made sure to take with him on his ships recently converted Jews who he thought would be able to speak Hebrew or Aramaic to the natives that he would encounter, right? So this idea that the lost tribes are scattered at the ends of the earth and that explorers will connect with them somehow is a very, very strong motif in the Christian imagination as well. So we can think about several reasons that some of these groups that are now gaining notoriety might have an idea that they belong to an ancient kind of Hebraic or Israelite heritage. So, the first one we can attribute to this sense of belonging is the idea of historic races. Well, we already know that in the Christian imagination, the lost tribes dwelled at the ends of the earth. These kind of ideas were picked up by missionaries and colonial administrators, and so we have all kinds of historical records of European explorers encountering strange peoples that practice customs that people in Europe didn't practice, besides Jews, that is. Customs like menstrual seclusion, Saturday Sabbath, male circumcision, food taboos, lunar calendar observation, these kind of things that were only connected in Europe with the idea of Jews, and therefore when they were encountered in other contexts were also attributed to long lost Jews. So we know that in Africa, for instance, there are many, many commonalities with Jewish dietary and purity laws, Saturday Sabbath observance. A lot of these things might be attributed to an exposure to Islam. More recently, especially in the post-colonial religious movements in Africa, there are quite a lot of churches that call themselves independent churches or Zionist churches that tend to skew toward a kind of Old Testamentism that rebuke the New Testament with this idea that the New Testament is really colonialism in disguise, right? And that the kind of mores and customs and pre-colonial practices prevalent before the arrival of the Europeans must be connected to a kind of ancient Israelite or Jewish heritage. Again, these are customs like Saturday Sabbath, menstrual seclusion, polygamy, libation pouring, right? Things that the European colonial authorities were quick to stamp out very, very soon. So for instance, in Kenya, the Kikuyu have a proverb. Proverb goes like this: when the white man came, we had the land and they had the Bible. They taught us how to pray with our eyes closed. When we opened our eyes, they had the land and we had the Bible, right? So this idea that, connecting Christianity with the European colonial project is something that doesn't go away, and that there's a need to move toward a different kind of religious association, which often finds its expression in things like Seventh-day Adventism, Messianic Judaism, or other African independent movements. So we mentioned the colonial paradigm points. A lot of this can be attributed to probably a shared kind of genetic heritage that doesn't necessarily date back all the way to the lost tribes. And again, Tudor Parfit is doing very exciting work on this. But we know we have many, many records of Jews who fled the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, who made their way to West Africa, to the Gulf of Guinea, who intermingled, who took African slaves, who intermarried with Africans. And so there are definitely genetic links here which establish those relations. So how much these kind of Jewish-like customs are really just a remnant of those 15th, 16th century links, and how much they actually go back to an earlier period is really something to consider. And then, of course, the cynics will say, well, this is all about monetary concerns. People from developing nations wish to improve their economic lot, and so they look to the Ethiopian example as a way to improve themselves and try to get naturalized in the state of Israel. I think that's largely just really nonsense. A lot of these groups that we now see springing up in Africa and other places have had historically no knowledge of each other. And when they think about a place like Israel, they don't actually understand that it's a modern geopolitical entity. They think about it in some kind of abstract terms, like it's in the sky or something. So I think that the idea that people are declaring themselves to be Jewish simply to make aliyah and enrich their economic lot is largely not the case. So here's another question. As my dissertation director used to say, who cares? Well, lots of reasons we should care, not just for broadening our historical knowledge. I forget who said it, but Ethiopia is mentioned in the Bible like 50 times, right? Poland isn't mentioned once. We know that historically the Jewish people were very, very diverse, and that these kind of linkages are not something to be taken with too much surprise, right? So I think it's important to consider the fact that the mosaic of the Jewish people has always been one that's been more diverse than we would like to kind of catalog it as today, simply dividing things into Ashkenazi or Sephardic. I think it's much more nuanced than that. You can also talk about theological reasons to care about this, right? Not just Jewish ones. The pinpointing of the place of the 10 lost tribes and then their eventual ingathering to the land of Israel is not just some kind of an abstract philosophical question, right? It's actually a theological imperative that's a necessary precursor to the coming of the Messiah, if you're thinking about a Jewish disposition, or the return of the Messiah, if you're thinking from a Christian position, right? So, I mean, the idea that these lost tribes might be gathered up and somehow taken back to the land of Israel is a very important theological component in the eschatology of millions of peoples around the world. So I think it behooves us to take this seriously, theologically speaking, as well. So I'll just provide a few more examples here in general of this phenomenon that I'm talking about, and I'll recommend a few sources to you. There's a great film by Gabriel Zilcha, who's a Canadian filmmaker, called Doing Jewish, about a group in Ghana. This group also features in my book. This is a very kind of prototypical story about an African Judaizing movement. So this is a context in which in the 1970s, a backwater province in Ghana, people are recently becoming literate and decide they don't want to convert to Christianity, but they want to read the Bible to learn more about colonial and neo-colonial presence. So when they're reading this Hebrew scriptures, they notice there are certain parallels with pre-colonial customs among the Segwi, this particular ethnic group in Ghana. Things like, as we said before, menstrual seclusion, polygamy, male circumcision, Saturday Sabbath, observation of a lunar calendar. And they think, well, we must also be lost Hebrews, and we have some kind of story about coming from the land of Israel. So they decide to go to the Ministry of the Interior in the capital city of Ghana, Accra, with the intent of finding other lost Hebrews. And when they do this, they think the other lost Hebrews are going to be somewhere in the West African region. Israel at the time has no relations with Ghana, and so they are sent to the nearest Israeli embassy in neighboring Ivory Coast. So the Israeli embassy doesn't really know what to do with this group of people coming and asking to be reconnected to other Jews. And so they ask them just to write, some kind of a missive, a letter, detailing their request. This group details their request, simply stating they want to reconnect with other lost Hebrews. And somehow this letter they pen at the Israeli embassy makes its way to Des Moines, Iowa. And Des Moines, Iowa, the congregation there happens to have people in Ghana who are in the Peace Corps. And there's a visitor who comes to this far western province in Ghana and kind of shows the people a bit more about post-exilic rabbinic Judaism, because before they had been thinking that their Jewishness is some kind of an Old Testamentism, right? And this group today is active in modern Jewish life. They have people studying in Israel and Uganda, and it's a thoroughly modernized Jewish community. Michael and I were talking earlier about the Igbo Jews of Nigeria, perhaps most famous in the West, tragically because of the Biafran War in 1970 and the genocide perpetrated against them. The Igbo have a long-standing claim to be one of the lost tribes of Israel. And this film here by Jeff Lieberman, that was made in 2014, discusses that claim, and also pinpoints some of these Igbo descendants living in the United States. This is not just sub-Saharan Africa. So in India, like I said before, there are definitely discursive instances of proof of Indian Jewish groups, but there are also more recent groups in India that have come up claiming Jewish roots that are not yet corroborated as such. One of these groups is the children of Ephraim, the B'nai Ephraim in South India. So that's me when I had a bit more hair there, visiting them in 2012. This is a group that distinguishes itself from its Hindu neighbors with the practice of things that are considered by them to be Jewish, things like burial of their dead as opposed to burning, eating beef, which in their case is water buffalo, and other kinds of food and purity taboos. The person you see on the Skype screen there, Yoshua, is the only one from his community that's actually converted to Judaism and moved to Israel, although there's a push by this community to become recognized, which to date has not yet happened. You may have heard of another community in India in the northeast called the Children of Manasseh, B'nai Menashe. No connection, even though in the Bible, Ephraim and Manasseh are brothers, who have been coming to Israel in the tune of about several thousand a year. Unlike the Ethiopians, Israel has not recognized them as a seed of Israel, but Israel has allowed a private enterprise called Shavei Israel, the returnees of Israel, to bring them to Israel and convert them in a kind of fast-track conversion program once there. But to date, the children of Ephraim have not yet benefited from such a gesture. And of course, there are many groups around the world who are just dissatisfied with their spiritual lot and wish to take on the Jewish religion from a sense of spiritual volition. The most famous group are the Abba Yudaya of Uganda. This is an album they made in the 1990s, and you may have heard of Gershom Chizomu, who was the first Black African to be ordained as a conservative rabbi. Another group I visited in the Ivory Coast in 2015 for the same reasons of spiritual volition, decided to convert to Judaism. A similar group in Cameroon, who are known occasionally as the Internet Jews because they discovered Judaism on the internet. They make no claim to have historical lineage. And it's very interesting to think about the role of technology and the emergence of these groups, right? Not just in our knowing in the West or in Israel about their existence, but about their accessing information online, right? So, I mean, you have this example in Cameroon, which is really interesting. This is a community based in a village about 2 hours outside of the capital that never had electricity, never had phone lines, was able to access information about Judaism by first going to internet cafes run by Chinese migrants in nearby villages. And they, downloaded over a period of about 10 years information from sites like Chabad, right? I mean, Chabad is a charismatic, ultra-Orthodox Jewish renewal movement, which doesn't seek to convert Africans or anybody else. It seeks to bring back into the fold secular Jews, right? And yet groups like the Beit Yesharon, the House of the Righteous in Cameroon, have been accessing such sites for years. And establishing the Jewish credentials through those sites. Now they have their own site, which people around the Cameroonian era are also accessing to learn about Judaism, mainly in Equatorial Guinea and neighboring Gabon. So this is, for instance, a site that one of the pages says, why don't Jews believe in Jesus? Then you have groups like the Ga in Eastern Ghana and in Western Togo. The Ga don't have any connection to the group I mentioned earlier, the Sebwi in Western Ghana. And they also don't wish to be Jewish religiously. They just wish to have their lineage, their ancestry acknowledged. So they're practicing Anglicans, right? Church of England, Episcopalians, we call them in this country. The Ga king in Garlands here told me during my visit that what he really wanted the world to do is to pressure the Anglican Church to allow the Ga to keep practicing polygamy and libation pouring, which he said were their most Jewish customs. And because they came from Israel, they should be allowed to practice these customs without being censored by the church. So this is me also with more hair, handing over some very, very expensive British schnapps to use to be used in the libation pouring. So when I told the king's linguist here that I thought it was, you know, a bit odd that they were using British schnapps to do libations with, he didn't really bat an eye. And I said, isn't that a bit neo-colonial, you know, using British schnapps, the schnapps of the former occupier um, to make libations with? And he said, well, we've always had schnapps. Anyway, let's move on now to the second part of the talk, Madagascar. So, what do we know about Madagascar? Well, in popular imagination, probably the thing that's most talked about with regard to Madagascar are these lemurs, these cute furry animals that resemble raccoons, and are the object of every tourist devotion upon arrival in Madagascar. Despite what DreamWorks says, there are no penguins in Madagascar, I'm sorry to say. It is the fourth largest island in the world in its landmass, about 27 million people. And as far as the Jewish connection goes, Madagascar has long been rumored to be the offshore trading site for the gold of Ophir, which is said to have been in modern day Mozambique or Zimbabwe. So the idea that Solomon sent fleets to Madagascar to sort the gold of Ophir before going back to the land of Israel is a long-standing kind of legend. Speaking of genocide, a little-known fact of Madagascar is that before the Nazis formulated the final solution, there was a plan to deport the world's Jews to the island of Madagascar. And this is talked about at length in a book by Adam Rovner called In the Shadow of Zion. So you see this clipping here. This is from a pro-Nazi South African newspaper in the 1930s. You can see the indication is population capacity of 100 million, right? The idea that Madagascar is big enough for the Jews of the world to be deported to. Apparently they decided this, or they considered this without any kind of connection of Madagascar's rumored long-standing Jewish presence. So in 2016, there were 121 people in Madagascar converted to Orthodox Judaism by the New York City-based outreach group Kulanu. And again, with regard to technology, it's very interesting to think that none of the rabbinical court had met any of these individuals in person. All of the communication about the conversion was done via Facebook, email, WhatsApp, Skype. A lot of times Google Translate was used. And this group that converted 121 people is just really, you know, kind of a drop in the bucket of many, many other groups in Madagascar who have long-standing notions of descent from one of the 10 lost tribes. So what do we know about the history of Madagascar? Well, if we look at genetic testing and at language, we can see that the majority of Malagasys, that's the descriptor for people living in Madagascar, are of a Malayo-Indonesian heritage. So Malagasy, the language, is closely related to Indonesian languages, to Tagalog, spoken in the Philippines, and genetic testing has basically shown us that the first inhabitants of Madagascar came from around the island of Borneo, probably by dugout canoe, in something like the 4th or 5th century BCE, and were only later joined by migrants from the African mainland in something like 800 CE. So the earliest settlers in Madagascar were Malayo-Indonesians, and you know, were later mixed with Bantu stock. Very, very early on, we have people noting supposed sightings of Jews on the island of Madagascar. So this, for instance, is a page from an account written by Al-Masudi, who was the famous 9th century Arab historiographer, often called the Arab Herodotus, who recounted seeing Jews and Hamites on the island. The European contact with Madagascar dates to about 1500. the British, the French, the Danish, the Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish. The French were the ones to have the most historical presence on the island, and different French colonial governors, like Etienne de Flacourt in this tome that he wrote, talked about the Jewish inhabitants and their Semitic customs, with different drawings that you can see here from part of the book as well. So like I said, the 121 people in Madagascar who converted to Orthodox Judaism are really just, a smattering of a much larger phenomenon on Madagascar that traces lineage to descent from the 10 lost tribes. This headline here from 2013 says, Jewish sects are changing the Malagasy religious landscape. And you have all kinds of people that claim Jewish origin and who are expressing Jewishness in different ways, most of it not normative. So Kabbalah is a very, let's say the pop culture version of Kabbalah is a very popular pastime in different parts of Africa. And a lot of these Malagasy so-called Jewish sects are using Kabbalah to influence political events and engage in things like sorcery and conjuring, etc. So the person on the right is a very famous leader of a sect called the Lala sect. His name is the Cohen Revo Lala. So whenever I was speaking to Jewish groups in Madagascar, the Cohen always had observers who were usually a bit intimidating. I tried to calm the atmosphere by referring to them as the Cohen brothers, but nobody seemed to get the joke. So in addition to these sects that use things like Kabbalah and esoteric forms of Jewish knowledge, you have also groups that connect their lineage to an earlier kind of exile. So this fellow here, for instance, is part of a group called the Aaronites, who connect their heritage to Aaron, the brother of Moses. They claim to practice priestly rites in this temple. And notice that in their account of how they got to Madagascar, they don't talk about the gold of Ophir being located in Zimbabwe or Mozambique. They don't talk about being exiled straight down the coast of East Africa. They follow actually the genetic kind of history, right? So they basically accept the idea that Malagasys are of a Malayo-Indonesian heritage, right? But that heritage came from people coming earlier through the Silk Road and in places that lost tribes were proposed to have dwelled, Afghanistan, China, Pakistan, etc. The Aaronites claim to never have been Christianized, although with some of these gestures and supplications, it seems like that's a bit of a far-fetched claim. They're very musical. They have what they claim to be a replica of David's harp. And a lot of the city dwellers who are involved in more normative-facing Jewish movements come to the Aaronites for questions about proper Malagasy heritage. A lot of people in the cities who have been practicing Christians for generations are out of touch with ancestral rites, and so often consult with people who are more village dwellers as to proper practicing of ancient Malagasy Judaism. So I encountered this group in a very strange way. Speaking of technology, I had read all kinds of material about this supposed Jewish presence on Madagascar in the scholarly literature. And I was reading, while I was in Ghana, an essay by Edith Bruder called The Malagasy Secret, which details centuries of rumors about Madagascar having this ancient Jewish presence. So I decided to see if there were any modern Jewish groups there, because I'd never heard of them before. So I did this very technologically sophisticated thing. I decided just to combine the term Jews and Madagascar in the Google search engine in French, Juif and Madagascar. And I happened to find a Facebook group that was hosted by the fellow on the right here with the folder in his hand. And he invited me to Madagascar to come meet his group. And it turned out I met dozens of groups that were practicing, varying forms of Judaism. So the fellow on the right, Eri, is a parliamentarian. He is a former student in Israel. He was an exchange student in the 1960s and 1970s. And he recalls fondly the era of Mashav being active in Madagascar. Mashav is Israel's international agency for economic development. And his goal in creating this association was to, do honor to the ancient Malagasy Jewish heritage, but also to liaise with the state of Israel and create economic and political ties. As of today, Israel has no diplomatic representation in Madagascar. Closest embassy is in South Africa. So when I was there in 2013, I attended this ceremony here, which was called an Israel-Madagascar Friendship Day. And it was held on the anniversary of Israel's founding, Israel's Independence Day. And in this gathering, you had people that were not just like from parliamentary groups or economic or special interest groups. You had different groups around the island that were practicing some kind of Jewish-oriented religious worship. So the person on the left, Ashrei, was the leader of the normative group of Jews. And Ashrei had been a former Protestant pastor, was famous in Madagascar for having a very popular cooking show on television, was also a DJ who had a popular radio show. He decided to start a Judaist association with some fellow Protestant pastors that were using the internet to learn more about what modern Jewish groups were doing. So, as I said, it wasn't very difficult to garner enthusiasm for this, given the very, very widespread and deep-seated perception that Malagasys are of Jewish heritage. So part of the day of this Israel-Madagascar Friendship Day was a part of the activity was this exhibit, this walkthrough exhibit on Jewish and Malagasy heritage, which in many cases was just Wikipedia pages in French printed out and pasted on this walkthrough exhibit. And I remember one woman was walking through the exhibit and came upon the section that dealt with the Holocaust, and there were pictures of victims of the genocide and survivors as well, pasted next to pictures of murdered Malagasy freedom fighters and people that participated in the insurrection against the French before their independence from France in 1960. And this woman was looking at the pictures of these emaciated Holocaust survivors and saying, how could they do that to us? How could they do that to us? And this perception that there was a direct link with that genocide was very, very strong. Also lots of mention of how the French have been traditionally anti-Semitic, and the Dreyfus Affair, and all kinds of correlations between what they saw as the French capitulation to the Nazis and the betrayal of the Jews with the French mistreatment of Malagasy natives. Move on to a bit more lighthearted comment here. We all know you have two Jews and you have three opinions. In this case, you have three Jews and four opinions. Anybody involved in community life knows the joke about the Jew that ends up on the deserted island and says he's going to build two synagogues, right? One in which he'll pray and the other in which he'll never set foot. Well, this kind of attitude is not confined to Ashkenazis or Sephardic Jews. In Madagascar, there was a very vocal and public shattering of the normative-oriented Jewish community in light of the 2016 conversions carried out by Kulano. And you have here just three persons who represent kind of the crux of the split. So one of them, a former physics teacher, wanted to include more Jewish mysticism in Jewish life that he felt was not being properly addressed by the American and Canadian rabbinical authorities that carried out the conversions. Another person thought the best way to learn more about Judaism and to grow Jewishly would be to toe the line of conservative, modern Orthodox, Western style Judaism. And then another thought that all of this talk about aligning themselves with North American or Israeli Jews was just rubbish and was corrupting the pristine kind of Malagasy Judaism this person had come to cherish. So, for instance, when I was there, I was giving a talk about something one day. Happened to mention I'd be leaving Madagascar on a Saturday, and there were just shudders throughout the crowd and these clicking of tongues and disapproval announced everywhere. And somebody said, "Well, how can you possibly travel on Saturday if you're Jewish?" And I said, "Well, many Jews in the modern era are secular, and you have to think about modern Judaism in light of the long-standing association between modern Jewish ideas and emancipation." Didn't work. Many people in this group felt that being involved with Jews who don't keep the Sabbath or who don't necessarily revere biblical customs is just a bad idea. And so one custom, for instance, they didn't understand why modern Jews wouldn't practice is polygamy. So again, this group, developed out of a Christian mindset, right? But their idea of Judaism, when they went to it, was something that was kind of like an Old Testamentism. So there's no knowledge, at least before, there was no knowledge about anything rabbinic, nothing about the Talmud, right? Just that every patriarch worth his salt was a polygamist, and there's no reason why modern Jews shouldn't do that as well. So they did learn about the famous edict issued by Rabbi Gershom in 1000 CE, permitting Sephardic Jews to have more than one wife, right? And were greatly dismayed to learn that this was not allowed in the state of Israel, even though the chief rabbis had allowed, at the beginning of the state, Yemenite Jews to come to Israel with more than one wife, but not allow anybody in Israel to wed more than one wife once arrived, right? So this, for instance, was just kind of inexplicable to the group that wanted to maintain what they called Malagasy Judaism, right? There was a man accused of a very serious transgression by the community, and they said they wanted to stone him to death. One person asked me if he should be wringing the heads off doves as a sin offering, like it's stated to do in Leviticus. And discussions about why such customs are not practiced in the instance of animal sacrifice, that it's not done post Second Temple, just kind of fall on deaf ears. So later on, with regard to polygamy, for instance, they learned about Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, the former Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, who was instrumental, by the way, in acknowledging the origins of the Ethiopians as being from the lost tribe. And toward the end of his life, Rabbi Yosef was in favor of a group calling itself Bayit Yehudi HaShalem, the complete Jewish household, which wanted to restore polygamy, both as a way of kind of recuperating a lost Sephardic heritage, but also as a way of combating the Arab demographic threat in Israel. And so Yosef thought that allowing Jews to have multiple wives and therefore many more children would be a way to counter the Arab birth rate. And the Malagasy Jews who wanted to see this custom restored or esteemed would cite his opinion in that matter. So I think I have about 7 or 8 more minutes here. If we're talking about Israel already, I think it's important to point out a few things here with regard to the groups in Madagascar. So as I mentioned before, there is no group besides the Ethiopians that has been allowed immediate naturalization in the state of Israel as coming from a lost tribe, right? Um, Israel has a policy for immigration that is based on the Nuremberg laws, right? Basically, the child or grandchild of a Jewish person is allowed to be naturalized immediately if that person doesn't have a criminal record, right? And if that person has not changed his religion to something other than Judaism. So obviously, this law was enacted in order to be able to accommodate Jews fleeing Europe, um, after the Holocaust, right? Many people who did not practice Judaism but who had at least one Jewish grandparent were given immediate naturalization in Israel. This law, though, only applies to someone coming from a recognized Jewish community, right? So someone coming from Russia or Poland or Argentina or Holland is able to immigrate to Israel under this law without any kind of question. But somebody who's coming from a community that's not been conventionally recognized as Jewish is not able to become naturalized in the same way. And so the Malagasis are not able to take advantage of this law, even if they wanted to. Now, the question is, do they want to? Israel's always this elephant in the room with regard to the motivations of these kind of groups. Well, we can say that the normative group that converted under the auspices of Kulanu, that's practicing something like a modern Orthodox style, is not at all opposed to the idea of going to Israel for study sessions or internships or things like that. But the idea of immigration is not central in their mind. People who are not of the normative community, people who are either Messianic Jews, and most of this community actually return to Messianic practice, or people who are involved in other kinds of iterations of Sabbatarianism or Jewish-like religious customs, right, don't see the need to give up what they're doing in order to prove to Israel that they're Jewish, right? So this person here who was talking to me about what being Jewish meant to him said, right, that the Israelite race flows through his veins, right? And that's what's important because he has proof in his spirit that he belongs to the Jewish race. And since he is a Jew by blood, he is compelled to carefully follow the belief of the ancestors. So when Western Jews hear this talk about Jewish blood, it makes people very uncomfortable, and it conjures up notions of ghastly Nazi ideas about eugenics and this kind of thing. But the idea that somebody with Jewish blood is Jewish and doesn't need to prove it by taking on rabbinic style Judaism is very, very common in Madagascar. And so some of the people that refuse to be converted would cite this kind of logic, right? That there's no reason I should convert to Judaism. I'm already Jewish. I don't need to revert under the auspices of some kind of foreign neo-colonial entity, right? I just have to do what I'm doing. And doing what I'm doing, following beliefs of my ancestors, is something that's, you can't argue with. I mean, it's different across the board. And people who think that being a Messianic, for instance, is just as Jewish as being someone who follows rabbinic Judaism, don't see changing their lifestyle to be a precursor for having a Jewish identity, right? So I think we can talk about a few major points of interest with regard to the future of this group and other groups. And I think one thing is that we really can't envision what the Jewish community of Madagascar is going to look like in 10 or 15 or even 20 years, right? It seems to be that most people in Madagascar are not going to align themselves with normative Jewish movements because they find them to be lacking in what Malagasy is considered to be true Judaism. There is a very vocal contingent that wants to adopt a kind of North American modern Orthodox type of Judaism. There's a contingent now in Madagascar that follows Dor Daim, which is a Maimonides-centric Yemenite, originally, stream of Judaism that seeks to um, emphasize teachings of Maimonides and push away things like Kabbalah and Jewish esotericism. Um, and they're now being schooled by a Dutch follower of that stream in Madagascar, who's there on business. So far, Israel has not made any kind of formal outreach to these Jewish groups. And in the white paper that the Ministry of the Interior put out in 2018 about emerging Jewish groups, the Malagasys were not mentioned. The ones in Uganda were mentioned, the Lemba were mentioned, but those are groups that have kind of a more long-standing presence in the popular press. I think what we can say for certain is that these kind of groups are not going away. There are millions and millions of people in developing nations, post-colonial nations, who see the return to Jewish roots and the recognition and acknowledgement of those roots as part and parcel of a post-colonial struggle. And whether or not they find support by a majority of North American or even Israeli Jews, I think is not going to change the way that they go about honoring this heritage, right? So I think my time is up there, but I'm very pleased to take questions and to keep talking about this as long as Michael will have me. So I guess I'll stop sharing my screen here and we'll.
Yeah, and I'm gonna offer a round of applause from everybody. That's it's incredible work, and what when one reads your book, you really talk about being on the ground. We're going to turn to some questions here. There's some very great questions, but I just want to start it off by asking you, how many of these groups have you actually visited and spent time with? I don't mean to sort of being in the field doing deep ethnography, but you've been around the block a couple of times. How many groups have you actually, met with? And
Well,
where?
I've met groups, I mean, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa, but I met groups in Senegal, Ivory Coast, Ghana, Benin, Cameroon, Gabon, Namibia, South Africa, Zambia, Rwanda, Kenya, Ethiopia, Madagascar, of course, different places in India. Yeah, I mean, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, but I mean, there are dozens of places that I haven't gone just because of issues of funding, and I wanted to make sure I could concentrate on groups that have kind of concerted public efforts at recognition. But this is a very, very common phenomenon, and even in a place like Senegal, right, where those who claim Jewish descent are practicing Muslims. They don't wish to become religiously Jewish or practicing Jewish, but they wish to have this Jewish descent acknowledged.
So I'm sorry, I got to do one further question based on what you just said, and then we will absolutely turn to the questions of the audience. So it seems to be fairly common that there's some kind of an introduction to concepts of the Hebrew Bible through Christianity initially. Although you just mentioned some contact or introduction to concepts of Judaism through Islam. Are there groups? I mean, are there significant groups or a number of groups that sort of come to Judaism through Islam, or is it more of a Christian story?
I think it's mainly a Christian story, and that's in part just because of the colonial heritage. But I mean, yeah, I mean, there are groups in Mozambique and Senegal and Guinea-Bissau who are practicing Muslims but who acknowledge Jewish origins. I'd say there are also several former Muslims I've met who are attracted to Judaism because of a shared kind of Semitic linkage, right? But I think on the whole, it's safe to say that this is mainly a Christian story, and that if anybody is talking seriously about kind of um, connections to Islam, it's in a historical context as to maybe explain how some of these things were transferred, right? Um, I mean, think about East Africa, right, and Zimbabwe. I mean, obviously, Arabian seafarers going up and down the East African coast, for more than 1,000 years, and connection with Islam that way can explain some of the commonalities. Um, but I think in the modern period, there aren't too many folks who are um, practicing Muslims who are willing to make that shift or want to make that shift.
Okay, so let's go to some fantastic questions from the audience. First of all, there's a lot of energy and excitement regarding your presentation. A lot of people sending applause,
Thank you.
um, and notes of this being fascinating, which I completely agree with. Let's do some fun ones and then some hard ones. So here's an interesting one: do the Orthodox Jews in Madagascar keep kosher? And I'm going to expand that more generally. What are the foodways like regarding some of these groups?
Right. So with regard to the Madagascar group, um, I mean, a critic might say, why would you convert them if they can't be allowed to live Jewishly in an Orthodox fashion, right? And the fact is that they did learn, Shkita and Mila from the rabbinical emissaries, but there is no kosher butcher in Madagascar um, um, to provide them with that aspect of the Orthodox Jewish lifestyle, right? Just like there's no way people can not travel on the Sabbath to get to the synagogue because the sprawling city of Antananarivo is huge, and there's no way you can walk across it because of time constraints, and also because you don't want to get mugged on the way home, right? So the answer to the Madagascar question is not really, right? There are certain people trained in Shkita, but a lot of times they rely on methods or instruction given to them from some of these people that are village dwellers that I mentioned, like the Aaronites, who have ancient ways of preparing meat that are supposedly Jewish. And other people, I mean, basically the answer is no. I mean, there's not a lot of possibility for the maintaining of Jewish infrastructure in these communities, which is one reason that Israel refuses to recognize them, right? And that people are critical of groups that go in and will convert a community that doesn't have the infrastructure to maintain an Orthodox Jewish lifestyle, whether that's through access to kosher food or separate schools or things like that.
But I mean, what not in terms of the technical orthodoxy of kashrut, but do they eat shellfish, or is there
Um,
a sort of a conservative style of only Chinese food outside and or on paper plates? In other words, do they have their methods to sort of be quasi kosher?
yes, quasi kosher is definitely on the menu. And a lot of places will a lot of people take pride in saying they don't eat things like monkey or snake or rodents, um, right? That these are prohibitions against unclean food they've followed for years. Um, you know, in Gabon, there was some dispute about whether or not um, people trying to live Jewishly could take certain medications that they were made from pork. Um, but I think that's the closest they ever got to pork, was through maybe um, medicines with coating made from pork, right? But no, I think you can say safely they would very, very carefully avoid um, the major kind of taboo foods that we know to be not kosher.
Oh man, so many good questions regarding to Madagascar. So when somebody's here saying that they recognize the challenge of kashrut, but are there mikvahs in Madagascar? Do they build a sukkot? What does it look like?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, for the conversions, there was no mikveh. They used the river,
Okay.
and rivers are used as the mikvehs. They do build tabernacles, yes, for the holiday of Sukkot. But there is no kind of institutional mikveh they go to. Ivory Coast, they're building one actually, but that community is quite well off, and so they're able to do that with their own funds. But no, I don't know of any other community that has anything like that in their plans.
So the economic disparity of these groups is also fascinating. It certainly isn't a class phenomenon, because certain groups, like the one in Cameroon that you describe in your book, really poor, trying to and getting all their information on the internet, and then that you're saying the Ivory Coast has got enough money together. This is actually leading to another question that we have here from Carol Woodward. What do you think about the work of Kulanu? So maybe you could tell us what Kulanu is, and then, tell us what your thoughts are about its interactions with some of these communities.
Sure. Kulanu was an association that grew out of an Israeli association called Amishav, the People Returns, formed in the 1980s. And that was headed by Eliyahu Avichail, who was the most famous lost tribes hunter. This was a guy that would, ride on the back of elephants in Burma looking for the lost tribes. Kulanu, I think, dates from 1993, if I'm not mistaken. Kulanu is an organization that I've had contact with for over a decade. I don't say that I am a proponent or an opponent of the work that they do, but I will say that they are the most active North American association that's involved in doing outreach among emerging Jewish communities around the world, right? And not just in Africa. I mean, they're doing a lot of work too among B'nai Nosim in South America and in Central America. So Kulanu, I think, is the most public, the most active Jewish outreach group, and the one that has conducted the most conversions among these groups overseas. It's also the one that is in, what do you want to call them, the crosshairs of a lot of the rabbinical establishment in Israel, thinking that converting groups that don't have the possibility of sustaining proper Jewish infrastructure is irresponsible. And that's, kind of a standard ultra-Orthodox argument against these traveling rabbinical courts, right? And that's in spite of the fact that Kulanu has a partnership with the Torah, what's it called? Rabbi Riskin's seminary in Efrat, or Torah Stone Seminary, right? In which you mentioned, Michael, the Cameroonians. Sarah Jatel, the leader of the Cameroonian group, has been studying for, I think, the past 5 years.
I forgot to unmute. I think it's in your book, or it might be in an article. Riskin actually sort of points out to some of what seems to be systemic racism among the Israeli establishment regarding some of these groups. So you seem to feel that the fear that these groups may be interested in Judaism for reasons of finally sort of making it to like a welfare situation in Israel is really unfounded, that most of the groups are not all that they're interested in visiting as a tourist or maybe studying, but they're not that interested in Aliyah. Is that right for most of the groups, or?
I think that's true pretty much across the board. I mean, and I think if you look back at the genesis and motivations of these groups, the idea is to recapture the Jewishness that was lost and make sure that it's transmitted to future generations in the place where they live, right? I mean, the idea of moving to Israel and benefiting economically from immediate naturalization is really not on anybody's radar. I mean, not much, right? Also, a lot of people have a problem with the way that Israel treats its Ethiopian citizens.
Right.
People that are following the Israeli news will often talk about, rabbis in Israel who refuse to marry Ethiopian couples, or who still refuse to acknowledge Ethiopians' Jewishness. I mean, they see that some of the children of Manasseh from Northeast India have been settled beyond the Green Line, and consider that to be, a problematic kind of political ploy, right? And a lot of the groups that are veering more towards something like ultra-Orthodox Judaism don't like the fact that buses in Tel Aviv run on Saturday, right? And that women are allowed to wear pants. These kind of things they think are incompatible with true Judaism, and so a lot of them think that Israel has abandoned true Judaism in favor of some kind of um, 21st century capitalist lifestyle. Also, by the way, I should mention in the Ivory Coast there was a fellow who was publicly proclaiming that black Jews should avoid Israel because Israel treats blacks in a way that's racist. And I will never forget what this guy said. He had a diplomatic passport, went to Israel as a tourist, wanted to enroll in some kind of short-term Jewish learning program. And even though he had a diplomatic passport, he was stopped when he got off the plane. He was questioned as to why he had a skull cap and ritual fringes. And even though he explained that he had been studying Judaism and wanted to convert, he said he was treated very, very poorly. And then this is the thing I wanted to mention. He said that I'll never forget, it sent chills down my spine. He said, "They treated me so badly. If I hadn't already had a Jewish soul, I would quickly become an anti-Semite."
Oh, jeez.
So, I wouldn't say that that's a common feeling, but I would say that a lot of people might value their sense of being Jewish and the Jewish religion, but wouldn't necessarily equate that with what happens in Israel, with the way that Jews in Israel behave. Right?
Well, I mean, they're not that different from American Jews then. So, there's a complicated relationship with the state.
Right, and with regard to American Jews too, I mean, there's a question of what do you want to call it? Kind of progressive American Judaism that is supportive of things like gay rights and transgender folks. That a lot of some of these more traditionally minded communities don't see as being compatible with Orthodox Judaism, right?
Yeah.
So what one person in Cameroon told me that homosexuality is another kind of genocide because it prevents children from being born. So, I mean, there's a gulf too among some of the progressively minded communities that are supporting these emerging congregations in Africa, and the more traditionally minded people who might not fully understand the extent of the progressive nature of North American Judaism, right?
I remember that regarding some of the Madagascar Jews that you mentioned, some of them want to rebuild the temple, and that you sort of you didn't know quite what to say to that concept.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure that a third temple right now is a good idea.
Yeah, I'm going to be on your side of that one. Here's a question from the former chair of my department, Dr. Pashur Singh, expert in Sikh studies. In fact, we should have Dr. Singh come and speak to our group here because he's an expert on scriptures, and there's a lot of comparative scripture work. So that's actually a good idea. But anyway, Dr. Singh wants to know about the conversion processes regarding some of these different groups. And I guess that's a generally, it might be different from all of them, but I imagine some of them imagine that they are already Jewish, so there's no conversion, and some want some kind of an official conversion. So what are your thoughts about that kind of a question?
Right. I mean, I guess, the only group that's been treated with kid gloves, I would say, with regard to conversion are the Ethiopians, and they were given the possibility of doing a precautionary conversion, a Giur l'Chumrah, which is different from a conversion undertaken by someone who doesn't have a semblance of historical connection to Judaism, right? The group in Northeast India that's being allowed now to come to Israel on tourist visas and enroll in Jewish seminaries is able to undertake a kind of fast track conversion, right? That takes about a year. But it's still, quite intensive compared to, for instance, the conversions that are done by Kulano, right? Which still take a lot of time and preparation, but are done just in a matter of days on the ground, and with very little kind of follow-up support. I mean, I'm still getting emails from friends in Madagascar asking me to clarify concepts about Jewish burial or Jewish marriage, or about liturgy and prayer that they're having difficulty answering post-conversion. So I guess the answer I would give is that there's no Vatican in Judaism, right? I mean, things are kind of done on a denominational basis and often on an ad hoc basis, and that um, the conversions carried out would not pass muster in Israel in 99.9% of the cases. It's even true, for instance, for the example of the leader of the Indian group I mentioned, Shmuel Jacobi, who was a leader of the B'nai Ephraim movement in South India. He actually spent 3 years in New York City and converted to ultra-Orthodox Judaism with the help of Chabad. But Israel did not recognize his conversion because it was done in a community other than his own, and it wasn't done in his home country.
Wow.
So they petitioned the state to recognize his conversion. They didn't, even though the rabbi under whom he served is considered legitimate for all purposes by the rabbinical authorities.
What do you think is the back? I mean, we have 3 more questions here, but that's an important point. What do you think is the backstory there? Why would Israel have rejected that?
Well, I mean, it's a great book. Yulia Egorova and Shahid Perez literally wrote the book on this community, and it's called Being Jewish in Andhra Pradesh. And their estimation, which I think sounds very logical, is that the group in India, in South India, is from the second to lowest caste among India's 120 scheduled castes, and so they have been traditionally relegated to things like cleaning up human and animal waste, threatened with pain of death if they would wax their mustaches upward or would walk on the same side of the road as an upper caste Hindu. And there's something like 11 million people in this caste in the state of Andhra Pradesh, and the story goes that once Israel heard that this entire caste was impoverished, and the leader was trying to make public claim that would perhaps facilitate recognition, they shut the doors, right? And so this leader's son, Yehoshua, who was in the Skype video I showed you there, is the only person of the community to have actually gotten citizenship in Israel. And that's probably because he flew under the radar. He did that, before his father's conversion, and before, I forget which year it was. There was a popular broadcast on Dutch television highlighting the plight of the community. So, what goes on behind closed doors in the Ministry of Interior in Israel is anybody's guess. But it seems very odd that such a very large community doesn't have more than one person represented in terms of citizenship in Israel to date, right?
Yeah. No, I think you've painted a pretty clear picture of what's going on. Okay. So I'm going to do 2 more questions, and then we're going to thank you we've winded you here. So we kept you all 10 rounds of this boxing match. And you're on your feet still. So here's 2 more questions. One is from Tammy Carmer. Is Jewish ancestry a race or a religion? I'm going to actually reframe that into the regarding some of the thought. What are the thoughts regarding some of the groups thinking about their heritage? Do they have racial ideas about it, ethnic ideas about it, religious in the sense of you can convert in or out and it sort of doesn't matter regarding genetic heritage? Well, how do the different groups think about these things?
I'd say it's almost across the board a kind of racial or ethnic or phylogenetic idea of heritage, right? That if you're born to a Jewish parent, that you're a Jew, right? And they don't distinguish between matrilineal and patrilineal. I would say, religion is viewed in terms of the choice of how it's practiced, right? But I think it's kind of like the way the rabbis discuss Jewishness. I mean, obviously matrilineal in the case of rabbinic Judaism, but you can be a BLT eating, axe murdering Jew and still be a Jew, right? Just a bad Jew, and you're not a Jew until you convert voluntarily to another religion. And so I think they would take that even further and say, well, even if you've been practicing something that's not authentically Jewish, it doesn't mean that you stop being a Jew, right? And that It doesn't mean that someone has to. Doesn't mean that you should be made to practice rabbinic Judaism before you're considered to be a Jew, right? So I see they would see it along racial, genetic, ethnic lines for sure.
Okay. And here's our capstone question here from Leslie Roth. Are some of the Jews that are unrecognized messianic? Maybe you can just talk to us about the question of messianism, Christian messianism, Jewish messianism, and non-messianic regarding some of the groups that you've been involved with.
Right. Yeah. I think this is a great question and something that I should have addressed more carefully. Because this is a Christian story in so many of the cases, it's quite common that people come to normative Judaism through Messianic Judaism. So I think we have to reframe when we think about Messianic Judaism. I mean, in the United States, for instance, Messianic Judaism is seen as a kind of predatory entity, right? By many Jews, that it's Christianity in disguise, that it's targeting people who don't know better, right? Whereas in Africa, Messianic Judaism is seen as a kind of bridge between some kind of Christian practice and Jewish practice. And so a lot of people who feel Jewish by genealogy or by race or ethnicity will encounter, alongside, let's say, a site by Chabad, a site of Jews for Jesus, or some kind of messianic Jewish website, and not understand that the vast majority of the Jews around the world don't accept as being Jewish someone who practices Messianic Judaism, right? They don't understand historical antagonism. They don't really appreciate the suffering inflicted upon Jews by the church and the Inquisition. They don't really have an idea of this historical antagonism. And so a lot of people initially don't understand why it's a big deal to be a Jew who believes in the divinity of Yeshua, of Jesus. And so, in Madagascar, the majority of people that I encountered ended up going back to Messianic Judaism. They didn't think that somehow negated their Jewishness, whereas the normative community felt like they were being, they were backsliders. They were like, clinging to an abuser as a dependent or something, as opposed to making the full leap to freedom. So, a lot of the folks I know who work in Africa on outreach are, I would say, more tolerant of Messianic Jews, at least initially, than you might expect. And that's just because people don't, with the advent of the internet, there's a bit more access to what constitutes normative Judaism. But historically, and I think, because of the different ways in which people access information, it's unlikely that someone who chooses to renew their Jewish observance is going to have a proper idea of why Messianic Judaism is seen as completely taboo by the majority of the world's Jews.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the different, what you just pointed out, which is just the different historical experiences of the groups. One where Christianity is a 2,000-year experience, and this other group where the Christianity is a 200-year experience or less, is a very different. It's a very different setting. I'll say it again. If people want one book in Jewish studies written in the 20th century, Nathan's book is it, as far as I'm concerned. This is such fascinating work. There are literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people across in many locations across the world that are discovering, rediscovering, claiming Judaism, and they have not been on the radar. And it's work like Nathan's and Tudor Parfit's and a few other people that are bringing communities together to finally see one another. So thank you so much for being with us today. We're going to have you back again when the next book comes out, or maybe before. We'll have to see. And just thank you for your work.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed this interaction, and I wish all of you the best. And thanks again.
Yeah, this is great, folks. So please check out Nathan's work. Those of you who are interested in further events, the UCR Palm Desert website has an events page for all kinds of great stuff going on at UCR Palm Desert. It's the same thing with UCR Chas has also an events page that is often open to the public. And of course, we have Temple Isaiah with a wonderful synagogue, but also a Jewish community center and many events. And these are all of our partners. And we are so glad to have been with you here tonight. So thanks, everybody. And we are going to call it a night. Good night, everyone.